Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, October the 14th, 2025. Just after the Second World War, Winston Churchill famously described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But of course, Russia isn't the only country that represents, shall we say, a contradiction, especially to outsiders. The United States also is a very confusing place, especially these days. How can a country that elected Barack Obama twice also elect Donald Trump twice? That is the question that my guest today, a very distinguished American historian and sociologist, Paul Starr, asks in his new book, American Contradiction, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to Now. It's out today, and Paul is joining us from Princeton, New Jersey, where he teaches. Paul, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
So it comes with a question, American Contradiction. What does the word, I looked the word contradiction up, of course, because one can do anything these days, Paul, on the internet. Its definition online, at least, is a combination of statements, ideas, or features of a situation that are opposed to one another. There's a kind of, I guess, a Hegelian quality to this. What is, Paul, the American contradiction at the heart of your book?
That title works in two ways. So first, it's the contradiction you've already alluded to. The contradiction in the subtitle, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to now. So there's the America of the revolution, a kind of revolution that took place in the mid to late 20th century, a revolution in relations of racial and gender equality. And that led to the America of Obama. And on the other hand, there's the America of revenge. There's the America that hated those changes, that opposed those changes, and today wants to take revenge against the liberalism that allowed and led to those changes. And that's the America of Trump. So understand the book in that way, and that's fine. But there is another meaning to the term American contradiction in the book, because I intend to connect what's happened recently to the deeper origins of these issues in American history. And so this is a country, the United States, that was born in a contradiction, the contradiction between freedom and slavery. It was at the heart of the foundation of the United States. We didn't just found the country on high principles. The country was also founded on a system of racial slavery that existed at first actually in all the colonies and then later in the southern states. And that contradiction, of course, led to an actual war, a civil war. I'm not suggesting that the one we suffer from today will lead to armed conflict. Well, it might, but I'm not making that prediction. But the argument of the book is that that founding contradiction has had its descendants through our history. And the connection to the most recent phase is that it was the struggle against the legacies of slavery, the Black freedom struggle of the 20th century, that really set in motion a whole series of movements among women, among LGBTQ people, movements that challenged the old hierarchies of social life, white over Black, men over women, straight people over queer people, a whole host of relations that had not really been fundamentally changed by earlier movements of reform, the New Deal, and going back to the turn of the century progressive era in the early 1900s, they hadn't really taken on fully all of these social hierarchies. And what was, I think, the most ambitious egalitarian movement in all of American history, the one that began in the mid 20th century and that tried to overturn all these relations, that did challenge those relations. And it is no surprise that that has met a counter movement and now a counter revolution, and the fight that we now are embroiled in.
As you say, the subtitle of the book is Revolution and Revenge from the 50s to Now, although, as you also note, you go back to the founding of the Republic. Is this a struggle, Paul, between good and evil? Is there a moral quality here?
Well, I don't want to deny that my sympathies lie with the egalitarian side of this, but I also really want to emphasize that I have sympathy with the people who feel displaced, who feel that the country has deserted them, abandoned them. And that's partly because there's another aspect to this history. There are lots of complications in this history, by the way. I wouldn't have written a book this long if there weren't complications. And the leading complication is that these changes coincided with enormous changes in the economy and economic policy. And those undermined the lives and communities of many working people who felt betrayed and dishonored. And their support has been critical to Donald Trump, to the movement that he's led. So I don't want to put it so starkly in terms of good and evil. And I also want to emphasize there are just a lot of aspects of this that I'm trying to tell that don't fit into that simple narrative. So, I start out with this big theme, but there's a lot more to it as I develop it in the book.
Yeah, it's an ambitious book and an ambitious story. Are we at an end now, Paul? I mean, it seems to me, you're talking to me from your office at Princeton, that technology is changing everything once again, and perhaps the progressive left that you describe in your book is about to experience its own civil war, its own end of slavery with new technology, with AI. Is it possible that social forces that were once on the side of revolution shift over to the other side, to revenge? In other words, the good guys turn into the bad guys?
Well, I'm not quite sure how you make that argument. So I've also written a lot about changes in technology and the media.
Your book. I always admired your book. I remember I've written some books about media myself. Your book, The Creation of the Media, Political Origins of Modern Communications, is an excellent introduction to the digital revolution itself.
So, so I don't see this new phase as being so fundamentally different to all the ones that preceded it. With each change that we've had, this goes back to the telegraph and telephone and broadcasting and so forth. There have been different phases that pose new challenges about how to interpret basic principles like free speech, intellectual property rules, and so forth. And each one is accompanied by struggles about how to interpret these American ideals, liberal ideals in many ways, like free speech and property rights, how to interpret them in a new context. And I just see that challenge happening again. I don't know that it means that there's this switching that you're talking about, where those who were revolutionaries become counter-revolutionaries. I don't quite see that.
A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with a historian on the West Coast from Claremont College, Nicholas Buccola. He has a new book out called One Man's Freedom, which is a sort of a dual biography of Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King and their struggle over the definition of freedom. Your book, Paul, begins in the 1950s. Are there particular characters for whom, both on the left and the right, both in terms of revolution and the revenge, that with whom your narrative begins? Goldwater and King are both, of course, figures really from the early 60s.
Yeah, so I begin with the 1950s, and I make that the backdrop because I think for many people, including Donald Trump and including many others, that was a kind of normal America. It's the America they remember from when they grew up. There was, the United States stood astride the world economy. It was, the most powerful country in the world, and yes, in conflict with the Soviet Union, but the United States was the dominant country, and it consistently represented, in the minds at least of many Americans, the country's ideals. So that's a kind of backdrop, I think, to what happened later, and what is, so there's been recent polling asking people, do you think that the changes since the 1950s have been good or bad? And among Republicans, you find that 2/3 say that the changes have been bad. And among Democrats, 2/3 say the changes have been for the good. So we're kind of divided about the heritage from that period and what it represents. Now, you asked me about personality. So, I think there are a series of people who, like Martin Luther King, were identified with the movements for change, the women's movement and the gay movement and so forth. And they destabilized what had been kind of the old political equilibrium in the country. And the kind of conservatism that Goldwater represented, I think in retrospect, was really only the first stage of what ultimately led to Trumpism. I think that history of the right now looks a bit outdated, because what Donald Trump stands for is very different from the Republican conservatism from Goldwater to Reagan.
What about Joe McCarthy? It seems to me that this idea of revenge, which is central to your narrative, existed certainly in McCarthyism and this hatred of communism. Hasn't this been a persistent feature in American politics, of this deep suspicion, a paranoia? Historians have written extensively about this in American politics, a kind of reactionary paranoia against outsiders.
Yeah, there's a great book of the historian Richard Hofstadter called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And yeah, I mean, I think you could absolutely trace a line from McCarthy to Trump. The connection there is Roy Cohn, McCarthy's aide, who became an advisor to Trump. There are definite connections, and you can find earlier examples of it as well. So I'm not saying that Donald Trump invented this. I think there are absolutely long roots that extend into the past, but I don't think that was fundamentally the spirit, let's say, of Reaganite conservatism. So Reagan was a more sunny, optimistic president. He didn't have that dark anger and hatred that Trump has. When Trump said at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, "I hate my opponents," I just can't see that as a phrase that Reagan would have used, or even Goldwater. Certainly not somebody like John McCain. The public expression of hatred like that by a president, the open demand for revenge by a president, modeling revenge. It's just extraordinary. It's disturbing. It's not, I don't think we've actually seen anything like that in modern American history coming from a leader of the country.
Certainly a theatrical quality to it. How do, I'm thinking out loud here, Paul, a couple of American presidents fit into your narrative one pre-50s, FDR, and the other Eisenhower. Of course, the conventional view is that there was a thing called Eisenhower's America where there was a degree of unity, of course, although many were excluded, African Americans and women and so forth. What about FDR, though? How does he fit into your American contradiction? Was he? A lot of people, particularly on the left, are nostalgic now for FDR's New Deal. Were the forces that you describe in American Contradiction, was that the first round of this struggle between revolution and revenge?
I think there was definitely a threat during the 1930s of a kind of right-wing movement, very much like European fascism at the time, and that the United States avoided that because of the successful changes that Franklin Roosevelt was able to make, and because he channeled the resentments of the time in a productive way into reform. And although business at the time thought he was destroying capitalism, the truth is he saved it.
So he was a good guy.
In my view, yes, very much so.
And then what about the Eisenhower question? Did he navigate between revolution and revenge? How would you interpret the republicanism of Eisenhower, which dominated the 1950s?
Eisenhower rejected the far right of the time, the John Birch Society and others like it, and also the conservatism of Robert Taft and others who wanted to attack the New Deal, but Eisenhower accepted it, accepted Social Security, for example, accepted the changes that had been made in relations of labor and business. Unions became part of American, America's accepted institutions. So there was a certain degree of conciliation in Eisenhower in that world. But really, there were also, the 1950s had a lot of strikes. There was a lot of conflict between labor and business. There was the civil rights movement. So it wasn't all harmony. It wasn't that kind of perfect suburban white picket fence, country that got portrayed in the TV sitcoms of the day.
So in your historiography, Paul, is it a kind of teleology? Are we going somewhere, or should we be going somewhere towards equal rights? Is that what's driving? Is that the motor of your narrative?
Okay, it is not a teleology. I have no idea where this will all lead. It is a battle. It has always been, and it will continue to be a battle. And we don't know, we can look back, and in the past, you can identify moments when a new kind of political regime was consolidated, when fundamental changes were made and persisted. But we can't say of that of the moment that this is the turning point, that right now, for example, Trumpism will become the new normal, will become the way this country operates for decades in the future. I don't know that, and I don't know that it'll be overturned either. I'm sorry if I'm not telling that kind of a story. The idea is that the idea of this book, there's a deep rift in the country. It extended back, to the beginning, to the very founding of the country. And we are fighting again, another version of the battles that have been fought before. And though the end of those battles weren't preordained, and the end of this one isn't preordained.
So that rift is, as you noted at the beginning, about slavery and freedom. Is race still central? Is race the thing that kicked over the hornet's nest, the development of the civil rights movement in the 1960s? And then does that mean that the people on the other side are racists, or are they against the idea of civil rights? Can one be against civil rights and not be a racist?
I don't use the word racist a lot in my book, and I even refer to what I call racial reductionism, which I think is a mistaken effort to reduce everything in American society to race. So I think the Black freedom struggle set a model. It kicked off that whole series of movements I alluded to earlier, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement. And I don't mean that just, in a metaphorical way. I mean, there were certain legal claims that were established in the Civil Rights Act and in other legislation. And those legal claims against racial discrimination became the basis of claims against sex discrimination, against gender discrimination more generally. The whole idea that there was an analogy between race and sex, between racism and sexism. And the cultural ambitions, the economic claims, the whole series of ideas about equality and equal respect, not just equal rights, but equal respect, that emerged out of this struggle that was originally about race, but it wasn't only about race.
What about the role of Richard Nixon in all this? I'm always amazed with the fact that Nixon at one point, I think, was quite popular amongst African Americans, certainly in 1960 when he ran for president. And then, of course, he changed, discovered what was known as the Southern strategy. How central is, I want to get to Trump in a minute, but how central is Richard Nixon in perhaps inflaming what you call this American contradiction in the 1960s and early 70s?
Well, I have a long discussion about Nixon in the book, and it doesn't quite fit what you're saying. So Nixon courted the forces of backlash to get elected. You mentioned the Southern strategy. And he himself was no egalitarian on race or other things privately. And he abused the powers of the presidency, which led to the Watergate scandal and later the reforms that followed. But his own administration was actually a continuation of the liberalism of the 1960s. So substantively, Nixon, well, first of all, he's the one who introduced affirmative action in private employment. He's the one who actually desegregated Southern schools. He approved a vast increase in environmental and economic regulation. He called for a nationally guaranteed income. He campaigned for a national health insurance plan that was more generous than any subsequent plan endorsed by Democrats. Nixon does not, and some people have called Nixon the last liberal. And in many ways, substantively, he really, if he had been successful in establishing a nationally guaranteed income, we would have a very different memory. That only failed narrowly in Congress. But I think really he wanted to be the American Disraeli. He wanted to be the conservative who co-opted reforms, and that. So he doesn't fit the usual picture. But temperamentally, he had a lot in common with Trump. but in substantively in policy, no.
So where are the roots of Trumpism in the 50s, 60s, 70s? Is it on the far right? Is it with Reagan? You mentioned Reagan earlier. You suggested that that Reagan and Trump aren't natural bedfellows? Is it with Gingrich? What happened, Paul, that has created on the right, within the Republican Party? What happened to create Trumpism? I know in some ways you've suggested that there's and I'm careful with this word, and correct me please if I'm wrong, there's a kind of inevitability to some extent of Trumpism in the 2020s. What took place?
Yeah, I don't think I ever used the word inevitability, but let me just...
Or logic, anyway.
So the first half of the book is called American Revolutions of the 20th Century. It's the ones that we've been talking about. It ends with a chapter called Half a Counter-Revolution, which is about Nixon and Reagan. Only half a counter-revolution because although their policies did increase economic inequality, they didn't really stop the momentum of the changes on racial and gender lines. So that kept going. The second half of the book is called Sleepwalking into Revenge. And the argument there is that many of the changes that began, I see the 1990s as really being crucial. Many of the changes had an impact, had effects that people did not fully understand. They didn't understand the impact that free trade would have on manufacturing employment in the United States. They didn't understand in particular that it would have concentrated effects in the South, in the Midwest, and that the communities that experienced the loss of manufacturing jobs would go through really terrible time, later opioid epidemic and so forth, and that politically they would turn sharply to the right. People didn't anticipate that immigration would have the effects that it ended up having. I go back there to the original 1965 immigration reforms that eliminated what were called the national origins quotas, and the main people arguing for those laws were the descendants of Jewish and Catholic immigrants who had been excluded under laws dating from the 1920s. When Ted Kennedy spoke at the first hearing in 1965 about that legislation, he said, "The ethnic mix of this country will not be upset." They really just did not understand and I absolutely believe that's true, by the way, having read through the hearings. They just had no idea of what the implications would be, the long run implications would be of the new immigration laws. They didn't understand the forces that they were unleashing and how those would combine with the changes in the economy, some of them directly the result of technology, of automation, and so forth, to produce a large group of Americans who felt they had been betrayed. And I think that was crucial. The buildup of that over time was crucial to the origins of Trumpism. It didn't play out fully for a while. Now, there's one other element here that I want to mention, and this has to do with demographic change, has to do with immigration. For a long time, people really didn't understand what that would imply. But beginning in the 90s, early 2000s, there began to be projections that whites would become a minority. And these were, I argue in the book, totally misleading. That isn't about to happen. It has to do with the way federal statistics were organized and the way the media reported them. But the whole idea that we were on the verge of becoming a majority-minority society where there would be a majority of people of color, that was a mistake. But the belief that it was true, I think, became a source of desperation among many people who felt the nation was going to be taken away from them. And so you combine the economic changes with this idea that demography was destiny, that whites were going to become a minority, and you get a kind of catastrophism on the right, a sense of desperation that I think opened many people to Donald Trump.
What about paths not taken, Paul. We've done a number of shows about Bobby Kennedy, for example. Many of your fellow historians see his assassination as the end of an opportunity for the progressive left to unite white and black working class Americans. Were there mistakes made, in your view, on the left amongst progressives within the Democratic Party to perhaps temper what you call this American contradiction, which is now metastasized into Trumpism?
So I don't know what difference Bobby Kennedy would have made had he lived. It's impossible to speculate about how things might have turned out. I just can't answer that question. But let me just, go back to that period, late 1960s and 1970s. You asked, were there mistakes on the left? So there were this whole series of movements, these racial minorities, women, and so forth, and they saw, by and large, the unions as part of the establishment, and they did so because often the unions defended the exclusive access to many jobs that white men had. They saw it also because the unions supported the Vietnam War. And so there was this breach on the left between labor on the one hand and all the new social movements, feminism and the Black movement, environmentalism, and so forth. And that breach unquestionably contributed to the weakness of labor in resisting the attacks that came during the Reagan administration, for example, and contributed to the long-term erosion of the interests of working people and their influence in the Democratic Party. So, yeah, I think that was a big problem.
Conservatives, of course, argue, Paul, that the feminist movement, civil rights, has also created a kind of intolerance, perhaps even a desire for revenge. They call it woke politics. Do you dismiss this in American Contradiction? Is this part of your story?
So I never know exactly what people mean by woke.
Well, I'm sure you do. You teach at Princeton. You may not agree with it, but you know what they mean.
No, because the way conservatives tend to use it now, they include, everything to the left of them. So it doesn't, you tell me what you mean by it.
Well, I mean an intolerance to hearing opinions that you disagree with, an offense on anything over race or gender.
Yeah, that's foolish. That's foolish. But, look, I was one of the people who signed a letter in Harper's a number of years ago.
That was the famous letter, wasn't it?
Yeah, denouncing the cancel culture and so forth. And so I'm not in favor of that. I think it's wrong. I think it's a mistake. But look, what I would say about that is that wokeism is to Trumpism as a flea is to an elephant. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time on it because I don't think it's really of that great consequence. And you take the issue of free speech. So there are undergraduates or others who are, denouncing various speakers and want to have them canceled. Okay, that's it's wrong. It's silly. It's nothing like using the Federal Communications Commission to threaten to take away the licenses of broadcast stations, which is what the current head of the FCC recently did. That's using the awesome power of the state to enforce certain opinions, and not some little local protest on a campus.
Trump and Trumpism seems to have, at least at this point, a great deal of energy. What's your analysis of the last two Democratic politicians to run for president? One won, one lost, Biden and Harris. How do they fit into your American contradiction? Is the left now recognizing, or no, maybe not the left, I mean, the American Democratic Party, people certainly to the left of Trump and Trumpism, are they successfully coming up with a vital, vibrant alternative to Trumpism? And if not, why not?
Well, they certainly haven't come up with that yet. So Trump has commanded the stage. He dominates every whim, every move. Dominates American politics, and obviously he's put Democrats on the defensive. So you asked about Biden and Harris, and Joe Biden historically was a moderate Democrat. When he ran in 2020, he faced a challenge in uniting a party, a good deal of, whose members had supported Bernie Sanders. And I think Biden, quite reasonably tried to bring those people into his campaign, and then after the election, into his administration. I think that was a tactical move on the part of a Democrat whose instincts were fundamentally moderate. And he won that election. I think he won it in part because of the circumstances of the moment, the COVID pandemic. I have a whole discussion about COVID and its cultural and political implications in the book. So many people seem to have forgotten what actually happened during that time, and Trump's conduct of the presidency and that time, I think, was really the immediate cause of his defeat in 2020. Harris. So you asked about Harris, and she was the wrong messenger for the kind of campaign that she was trying to wave. The campaign was actually also very moderate. If you go back to the Democratic Convention in 2024, the speakers were all emphasizing patriotism, and she would not even allow any mention of the Palestinian cause and other various causes. She wanted to move toward the center. But as I said, she was the wrong messenger for that campaign because of the image that she had established, and because she carried with her all the baggage that Biden had accumulated at that point, and in particular because of the inflation that had affected not just the United States but countries all around the world. In 2022 and 2023, leading up to that campaign, this had been a worldwide phenomenon, and political incumbents all over had been losing elections. So there was partly, I think, the 2024 election, many other things involved as to what happened in that election. But I think she was a weak candidate. If there had been a genuine campaign for the nomination, I don't think Harris would have been the nominee. I don't think she would have been running in 2024, but the peculiar circumstances with Biden staying in too long and then abandoning his campaign, after his disastrous first debate with Trump, and then she had, a very brief time, and she could not separate herself from Biden and get rid of the baggage. And besides, I mean, there is the basic fact that as a Black woman, she carried with her the burdens that identity gave her from the standpoint of a great many Americans.
Yeah, and of course, when you talk about COVID, your book, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, I think it won the 1984 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. So you're very, very well versed in the politics of American medicine. Finally, Paul, we are where we are. We're in the midst of what you call this American contradiction. Can we get beyond it? I mean, I began with referencing Hegel, who believed that all contradictions could be worked out in history. Can America's contradiction, this synthesis and antithesis, can it be resolved, or will there always be an American contradiction between the two forces that you describe in the book of revolution and revenge?
Oh, I do have hope that we can escape the contradiction. And, at the time, but I'm also sobered, by the mistakes I've made about that in the past. So when Obama got elected, I gave a talk. In fact, it was at Oxford about
Oxford, England, rather than Mississippi,
yes,
I would guess.
yes. About escaping from the American contradiction. That was the first time, in fact, I had used that term in a public talk, and I was wrong about that. We didn't escape from it. Obama's election, in retrospect, intensified racial feeling in the United States. A lot of people were hoping that it was going to be the end of it, but it wasn't. So, having been sobered from that mistake, seeing, the optimism of that moment prove to be very short-lived. I don't know, whether I will ever live to see the end of this fight. I'm not expecting it.
But if so, finally, Paul, how? I mean, I take your point, although I think there's more to Obama than just race. I mean, obviously race is important, but he wasn't purely a racial president. What can be done to get beyond this American contradiction? What are you advising in the book?
Well, first of all, the book does not have advice. There is no solutions chapter at the end.
You're lucky. Your publisher didn't force you to write one.
No, but
you're too famous to be told to do what to do. Most authors are told to have a solutions chapter. If there was a solutions chapter, would it be a page or two? What would you suggest?
Well, I'm not shy, however, and I have written articles that are about this. In fact, there's one that's focused really on the question of the Supreme Court and the law. An article called "The Post-Trump, the Premature Guide to Post-Trump Reform," in which I try to lay out what we would have to do to bring the presidency back under, reasonable control, and to correct for what I think are a whole series of mistaken decisions by the Supreme Court. So I'm very interested in trying to figure out what we would need to do when the opportunity arises. And I do think at some point such opportunities will arise, but we are so far from that moment at this point. We are in the midst of a daily battle over freedom and democracy in America. And it's hard to see what's on the other side of this. I do believe at some point, we are in the midst of what I have referred to as the counter-revolution of fear. The fear on the right that the nation would be taken away from them, and I believe at some point that fear, the whole movement of revenge, I believe it will subside. And I don't know what kind of country the United States will be on the other side of that battle, but that is what that's what we need to think through. There will be surviving elements of Trumpism. So I don't think we're ever going back to affirmative action. I don't think we're ever going back to free trade, at least not for a very long time. I think there are a lot of old battles that are effectively over, and we just haven't recognized that there is no turning back to some of those things that were earlier at the center of political conflict. Because now I think that we in effect have to move on. We have to figure out a new agenda. You mentioned technology and AI at the beginning. That's really going to be at the center, I think, of a lot of what we really have to deal with in coming years. So anyway, that's my thought about it. I think we need to put some old battles behind us and recognize they're over, and focus on other things that are really going to matter for the kind of country we have.
Well, there you have it. Paul Starr's new book, American Contradiction, Revolution, Revenge, and Revenge from the 1950s to now, is out today. Congratulations, Paul. Real honor, joy to have you on the show. A very forthright discussion, and love to get you back on. This American Contradiction is far from being resolved. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.